They took his land while he was gone. By sundown, they said his name like it never belonged there in the first place. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always need a gun, stay with this story. The wind that day carried dust across the Crow Ranch like it was trying to erase something. 30 acres of dry earth, split rail fences Elias had set with his own hands, and a porch that had seen more silence than laughter. It wasn't much, but it was his. When Elias Crow rode back in after 3 days away, the first thing he noticed wasn't the men. It was the sign, or what was left of it. His name, burned into cedar years ago, now split clean down the middle, hanging crooked on a nail that wasn't his. One half read 0, the other lay face down in the dirt. His horse slowed on its own, like it knew something had shifted. The porch was no longer empty. 2 men leaned against the posts, boots up, talking low. Another sat in Elias's chair, the one by the door where the wood dipped just slightly from years of weight. They didn't look up right away. Like a man riding into his own land didn't deserve that much. Elias didn't reach for his rifle, didn't call out. He just sat there in the saddle, the leather creaking soft under him, eyes steady, taking it in. A wagon stood where his water trough used to be, barrels stacked, tools he didn't recognize. The place smelled different, not of dry grass and horse sweat, but of ownership, the kind that comes fast and loud. One of the men finally noticed him. Spit hit the dust. You lost? The man asked, not unkind, but not curious either. Just certain. Elias tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, in recognition, like he'd already seen this moment somewhere before. The man in the chair stood slow, stretching his back like he'd been there a long time. He stepped forward, boots firm on boards Elias had cut himself. This land's under new papers now, he said, tapping his chest pocket. Name on it ain't yours. The words hung there, dry as the wind. Elias didn't argue, didn't ask to see the papers. His gaze moved instead to the door. The hinges were his, the handle worn from years of use. But the way it stood now, slightly open, like it belonged to someone else, that was new. A second man chuckled under his breath. Fella rode off and left it. That's how it goes. Elias swung his leg over the saddle and stepped down. Boots touched dirt he knew better than most men knew their own hands. He walked past them, not fast, not slow, just enough to show he wasn't asking permission. The man by the door shifted, unsure for a second, then stepped aside. Not out of respect, just uncertainty. Inside, the air was different. His table pushed against the wall. A stranger's coat hanging where his used to be. The small iron stove still there, but someone had polished it. Like they were trying to make the place forget who kept it alive through winters. Elias reached the far wall. His fingers brushed against the empty space where the sign had once been stored during storms. He stood there a moment, quiet. Then he turned, walked back outside, and bent down. The other half of his name lay in the dirt. He picked it up, ran his thumb along the split edge. The wood was still fresh where it had broken. Not long ago. The men watched him now, waiting for something. A protest, a threat, maybe a mistake. Elias looked at the broken sign, then at the land stretching out past the fence line. Sun hanging low, shadows long across every inch he'd ever worked. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even look at them again. He just turned back to his horse, slid the broken piece into his saddlebag, and pulled himself up in one smooth motion. Leather groaned. The horse shifted, and without a word, Elias Crow rode away from his own land like a man, leaving something unfinished, not lost. The road did not ask questions, and neither did Elias Crow as he followed it west, the rhythm of his horse steady beneath him. Each mile stretching the silence he carried like a second skin. The sun dipped low behind him, painting the plains in long shadows that seemed to reach back toward the land he had just left, but he did not turn around. A man who had built something with his hands knows the weight of losing it, but he also knows when something has been taken without a fight. It is not gone, only waiting. By nightfall, he made camp near a dry creek bed, the kind that only remembered water in the spring. He unsaddled his horse, moved slow and deliberate, every motion familiar, unchanged, as if the world had not shifted at all. That was Elias, the kind of man who did not let the ground beneath him decide who he was. He lit a small fire, just enough to warm his hands, not enough to call attention. The stars came out one by one, clear and sharp in the wide western sky, the same sky that had watched him drive the first fence post into that land years ago. Back then, he had nothing but a borrowed hammer, a tired horse, and a promise he never spoke out loud. He remembered the way the earth felt under his boots that first morning, dry but honest. No one wanted that land. Too far from town, too little water, too much wind. But Elias had seen something else. Not what it was, but what it could become if a man stayed long enough. And he did. Through seasons that gave nothing back, through winters that tested the bones, through summers that cracked the ground open like it was tired of holding together. He stayed. Because staying was the only thing he knew how to do. He had built the cabin board by board. Each cut measured twice. Each nail driven with care, not because anyone would see it, but because he would. There was no audience out there. No one to impress. Just the quiet understanding that a man's work should outlast his voice. He had named the place only once, carving his last name into that cedar plank, not for pride, but so the land would remember who first believed in it. Crow. Simple. Honest. Enough. The fire cracked softly as Elias reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the broken piece of wood. He held it in both hands, turning it over, feeling the rough edge where it had been split. Not by time. Not by weather. By someone who wanted it gone. His thumb traced the letters slowly, like he was reading something written long ago. He did not smile. He did not frown. But something settled behind his eyes, quiet and steady. He placed the wood beside him on the ground, careful, like it still held weight beyond what it was. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of coyotes somewhere far off. The kind of sound that reminded a man he was never truly alone out here, just far enough from others to hear himself think. Elias leaned back slightly, eyes on the horizon even in the dark, seeing not what was in front of him, but what had already happened. The men on his porch, the papers he had not read, the way the sheriff would have looked the other way without saying a word. He had seen it before, not to him, but to others. Land did not always belong to the one who worked it. Sometimes it belonged to the one who could take it and make it look right on paper. But paper did not hold fences together. Paper did not carry water in the dry months. Paper did not remember the hands that bled into the soil to make it worth something. Elias understood that better than most. And he understood something else too. He had not fought. Not because he could not, but because there are moments when a man chooses not to spend what cannot be replaced. He reached for his canteen, took a slow drink, then set it down beside the fire. The flames were low now, steady, controlled. Like him. In the distance, the land stretched on, open and waiting, the same way it had been the first day he claimed a piece of it. The same way it would be long after men came and went, names changed, fences moved. Land did not forget. It just waited for the right man to come back and remind it. Morning came without ceremony, just a thin line of light stretching across the horizon, turning the land from shadow into something real again, and Elias Crow was already awake, sitting where the fire had burned down to ash, his hat low, his eyes steady, like he had not slept at all. He did not rush. He never did. A man who had spent years building something from nothing understands that time is not an enemy. It is a tool, and only fools try to outrun it. He saddled his horse in silence, checked the straps twice, the way he always had, then mounted and turned north, not toward town, but toward higher ground where the land rolled into long stretches of rock and scrub, where fewer men traveled and fewer questions were asked. By midday, the sun hung sharp overhead, heat pressing down in waves that made the distance shimmer, and still Elias rode on, not chasing anything, not running either, just moving with purpose that did not need to be spoken. He passed no one, no wagons, no riders, just the quiet sound of wind brushing over dry grass and the steady rhythm of hooves marking distance in a language only men like him understood. Near the edge of a low ridge, he slowed, guiding his horse along a narrow trail that cut through stone and brush like it had been there long before maps ever tried to name it. At the top, he stopped. From there, the land opened wide, miles of it stretching out in every direction, untouched, unclaimed, or at least not claimed in the way towns understood ownership. Elias removed his hat for a moment, letting the wind touch his face, then set it back down and reached into his saddlebag. The broken piece of cedar rested where he had placed it the night before. He held it up against the horizon, the split edge catching the light, and for a second, it looked whole again, like the land behind him, like the life he had built. Then he lowered it, because a man who lives long enough knows the difference between what was and what still is. He slid the wood back into the bag and nudged his horse forward, down the other side of the ridge where the ground changed, where the dust grew finer and the silence deeper, the kind of place where stories did not travel unless someone carried them. Hours passed before he saw the first sign that he was not alone. Not a man, not a structure, just a line of stones arranged too carefully to be natural, marking something older than fences and paper claims. Elias slowed again, eyes scanning, not searching, just remembering. He had been here once before. Years ago, a different time, when the land had not yet turned its back on him. He dismounted this time, letting the reins hang loose, trusting the horse to stay, and walked the last few yards on foot. The air felt different here, cooler somehow. Even under the same sun, like the ground held something the rest of the plains had forgotten. He stopped at the stones and crouched, brushing away a thin layer of dust with his hand, revealing markings worn but still clear enough to recognize. Not his. Not written in any language the town would understand. But he knew what they meant. Not words. Not exactly. More like a boundary. Not to keep people out, but to remind them where they stood. Elias remained there for a long moment, quiet, respectful, the way a man stands when he knows he has stepped into something that does not belong to him, even if no one is there to say it out loud. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint sound, distant but real, the soft echo of movement somewhere beyond the ridge, not hurried, not hidden, just present. Elias did not reach for his rifle. He did not call out. He simply stood, hands at his sides, waiting the way a man waits when he knows he has finally arrived somewhere that matters, even if he does not yet know what it will ask of him. The sound came again, clearer this time. Not the wind, not the shifting of dry brush, but something with rhythm, something alive, and Elias Crow did not move, not yet, because a man who has lived long enough on open land learns that the first instinct is often the wrong one. He kept his hands at his sides, his posture steady, eyes forward, not searching for where the sound came from, but letting it come to him. A figure appeared along the ridge line, then another, then a third, not emerging all at once, but one at a time, like the land itself was deciding how much to reveal. They did not rush. They did not hide. They simply stood there, watching him the same way he watched them, quiet, measured, without threat and without invitation. Elias recognized the way they held themselves before he recognized anything else. Not townsmen, not riders passing through. These men belonged to the land in a way that could not be written down or sold. He remained where he was, feet planted in the dust, shoulders relaxed, not as a challenge, not as surrender, just as acknowledgement. The distance between them held steady, maybe 40 yards, maybe more, but it felt closer than that, the kind of distance that carries weight instead of space. One of the figures stepped forward, older than the others, his hair threaded with gray, his posture straight, his presence quiet but undeniable. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, it carried across the dry air like it had been waiting there all along. You remember this place. It was not a question. Elias gave a small nod. Once, nothing more. I do. The man studied him, not his clothes, not his horse, but his eyes, the way a man looks when he is searching for something deeper than words. Most who come here do not return. The man said, his tone even, not warning, not welcoming, just truth laid flat in the open. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the dust moving under his boots. I have been here before, he said, his voice low, steady. A long time ago. The man's gaze did not change, but something in the silence did, like a door opening just enough to let light through. Behind him, the others remained still, not reaching for anything, not stepping closer, just present, like stones that had always been there. The wind moved again, carrying the scent of sage and something older, something that did not belong to towns or fences. Elias reached slowly into his saddlebag, not sudden, not careless, and drew out the broken piece of cedar. He held it in both hands, not offering it, not hiding it, just letting it be seen. The split edge caught the sunlight, the name carved into it still clear despite the break. The older man's eyes dropped to the wood, then lifted back to Elias, and for the first time, There was a shift, small, but real. Recognition, not of the object, but of what it meant. They took it from you, the man said, again not a question. Elias did not answer right away. He looked down at the wood, his thumb tracing the carved letters, then back at the land stretching behind the ridge, far beyond what either of them could see from where they stood. They are standing on it, he said finally. The words were simple. No anger, no bitterness, just fact. The older man took a step closer, closing some of the distance, but not all of it. Enough to show he was listening. Enough to show he understood more than what had been said. And you came here instead of going back, he said. Elias gave the slightest shrug, a movement so small it almost disappeared in the heat. Going back right away would not change what they believe, he said. It would only prove it. The man's expression remained calm, but there was weight behind his eyes now. Something like respect, something like memory. So you came to remember what does not belong to them, he said. Elias did not nod this time. He simply stood there, the wind brushing against his coat, the land stretching wide in every direction, and the broken name resting in his hands. I came because this place does not forget, he said quietly. The silence that followed was not empty. It held something, something building, something waiting to take shape. Behind the older man, the others shifted just slightly, not in tension, but in awareness, like the moment had moved from one thing into another. The man looked past Elias then, toward the open land beyond him, as if measuring something that had not yet arrived. When he spoke again, his voice was just as calm, just as steady, but now it carried something more. Names can be broken, he said, his eyes returning to the cedar in Elias's hands. But the land remembers who stood for it. Elias did not respond. He did not need to, because for the first time since he rode away, he was no longer standing alone. The wind carried no urgency, yet something in the air had changed, the kind of shift a man feels before he can explain it. And Elias Crow stood there with the broken cedar in his hands, no longer just a piece of wood, but something that had begun to take on weight again, not because it was whole, but because it had been seen. The older man stepped closer, closing the distance to where only a few yards separated them now, close enough that Elias could see the lines time had carved into his face, not as weakness, but as memory worn into skin. There was a winter, the man said, his voice steady, many seasons ago, when a man came through this land with nothing but a horse that could barely stand and a coat that was not enough for the cold. Elias did not speak, but his eyes shifted slightly, not away, not down, just enough to acknowledge that he was listening. He did not ask for help, the man continued, and no one offered it at first, because men who do not ask often carry something others do not understand. The others behind him remained silent, their presence unchanged, but the space between them and Elias felt different now, not empty, not guarded, just open in a way that did not need to be explained. Elias lowered his gaze for a moment, the memory not forced, not sharp, but steady, like something that had always been there waiting to be called forward. I remember the cold, he said quietly, and the way the ground felt like it would not let go of your boots. The older man gave the slightest nod, as if confirming something already known. You stayed, he said. Not for long, but long enough. Elias let out a slow breath, not heavy, not light, just enough to move the dust at his feet. There was a boy, he said after a moment, his voice still low. Could not have been more than 10. He had a fever, the kind that does not ask permission. The man's eyes did not leave him, but something behind them shifted again, deeper this time. My daughter's son, he said. He remembers the man who did not belong here, but did not leave when the night came. Elias looked down at the broken wood in his hands, turning it slightly, the split edge catching the light again. I did not stay long enough, he said. A man stays long enough when he does not leave something unfinished. The older man replied, his tone unchanged, but the meaning settling into the space between them like weight on solid ground. The wind moved through the stones again, a soft sound, almost like a breath taken by the land itself. Elias lifted his head, his eyes meeting the man's once more, not as a stranger now, but as something closer to recognition. I did not come here for that, Elias said. The man's expression did not change, but there was no challenge in it, no doubt, only quiet understanding. No man ever does, he said. But the land remembers what men forget. Elias stood still, the broken cedar steady in his hands, the name carved into it no longer just his, but something shared between what had been and what still remained. The others behind the man shifted again, not stepping forward, but no longer holding the same distance, like the space itself had adjusted to include him. The older man turned his head slightly, glancing back at them, then returned his gaze to Elias. "You came without asking," he said, "and you stood without reaching." Elias gave the smallest nod. "It is not my place to take what is not given." The man studied him for a long moment, not measuring strength, not testing resolve, but weighing something quieter, something that does not show itself unless it is real. "And yet something was taken from you," he said. Elias did not look away. "Yes." The word was simple, but it carried more than the land, more than the cabin, more than the name carved into cedar. It carried the time, the work, the silence that had built it. The man stepped one pace closer, close enough now that there was no distance left to measure. "Then you understand," he said softly, "what it means to lose something that was never written down, but was always yours." Elias did not answer. He did not need to, because the truth of it stood there between them, as clear as the land stretching beyond the ridge. The man turned slightly, gesturing with his hand, not as an order, not as a command, but as an invitation that did not need words. Behind him, the others shifted, not closing in, but opening a path that had not been there before. Elias looked past them, into the land that lay beyond, deeper, older, untouched by the kind of ownership that could be signed and sealed. He slid the broken cedar back into his saddlebag, not hiding it, not protecting it, but carrying it the way a man carries something that still has purpose. Then he stepped forward, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to cross the line that had been there before he arrived. And for the first time since he rode away, the path in front of him did not feel like an escape, but like a beginning. The path beyond the stones did not announce itself. It simply existed, narrow at first, then widening as Elias Crow followed behind the older man, the others moving with a quiet rhythm that did not disturb the land beneath them, as if each step had already been agreed upon long before they arrived. The ground changed underfoot, less dust, more earth, the kind that held shape, that remembered weight, and Elias noticed it the way a man notices something honest without needing to name it. No one spoke for a while, and the silence was not empty. It carried meaning, like a conversation that did not need words to be understood. They walked nearly half a mile before the land opened into a shallow valley, hidden from the ridge, where the wind moved differently, softer, as if it respected the place it passed through. A few structures stood there, simple, built low to the ground, their shapes blending into the earth rather than rising above it, and smoke drifted upward in thin lines, not thick enough to call attention, just enough to say that life existed there, steady and quiet. Elias slowed without being told, his eyes taking in the details, not as an outsider judging, but as a man recognizing something familiar in a different form. The older man stopped near the center of the clearing and turned to face him, the others settling around them without forming any kind of wall or barrier, just present, like the land itself had taken shape in human form. "You came here with something broken," the man said, his voice as calm as before, but now carrying a weight that matched the place they stood in. Elias reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the cedar again, holding it at his side, not raising it, not hiding it, just letting it be part of the moment. "It was broken before I arrived," he said. The man nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Things are often broken before we see them," he replied. A woman stepped forward then, older, her hair pulled back, her eyes steady in a way that spoke of years spent watching more than speaking. She carried a small bowl in her hands, steam rising from it, the scent of herbs faint but clear in the air. She did not offer it right away. She simply stood there, waiting, the way one waits when the next step belongs to someone else. Elias looked at the bowl, then at her, then back at the older man. "You do not take what is not given," the man said quietly, not as a reminder, but as acknowledgement. Elias gave a small nod. "No." The woman stepped closer then, extending the bowl just enough that it crossed the space between them. "Then take this," she said, her voice soft but certain. Elias reached out and accepted it with both hands, careful, respectful, as if the weight of it mattered beyond what it held. The warmth seeped into his fingers, grounding, real. He did not drink immediately. He simply held it for a moment, then lifted it slowly and took a single sip. The taste was unfamiliar, but not strange, the kind that settles into a man rather than surprises him. He lowered the bowl and handed it back, just as carefully as he had received it. The woman nodded once and stepped back without another word. The older man watched this exchange, then turned his gaze toward the horizon beyond the valley, where the land stretched out toward the place Elias had come from. Men who take land with paper believe they understand ownership, he said, his tone unchanged, but the words settling deeper. But land is not held by ink. It is held by those who stand for it when no one is watching. Elias followed his gaze, seeing not the valley, not the ridge, but the ranch that had been taken, the porch, the broken sign, the men who now stood where he once did. They believe it belongs to them, Elias said. The man nodded slightly. Because no one has shown them otherwise. The words hung there, not as a challenge, not as a command, but as something waiting to be understood. Elias stood still, the wind brushing lightly through the valley, carrying the scent of earth and smoke, grounding him in a place that felt older than the conflict he carried. I did not come here to gather men, he said after a moment. The older man turned back to him, his expression unchanged, but his eyes holding something steadier now. No man ever thinks he does, he said. Then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, he added, but sometimes a man comes here so others can decide whether to stand with him. The silence that followed was not empty. It held the shape of something forming, something not yet spoken but already understood. Behind the man, figures began to move, not hurried, not forced, just stepping into place, like pieces of something larger aligning without instruction. Elias did not react quickly. He simply stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle into him. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just real. The broken cedar remained in his hand, the name still split, but no longer alone in what it carried. And for the first time, the distance between what had been taken and what could be returned no longer felt like something measured in miles, but in something quieter, something that did not need to be claimed, only recognized. They did not gather all at once. And that was the first thing Elias Crow understood as the morning stretched across the valley, light spilling slowly over the low structures, touching the ground before it touched the people, as if the land itself decided who would stand and when. He remained where he had been, near the center, not giving orders, not calling names, just watching as one man stepped forward, then another, then three more from the far side where the shadows had been thicker. Horses were brought out without urgency, their movements calm, their heads low, as if they already knew the path before it was spoken. Leather straps tightened, reins adjusted, saddles checked with quiet hands that wasted no motion. No one rushed. No one hesitated. It was not preparation for something sudden. It was the continuation of something already decided. Elias stood still, the broken cedar resting against his leg, his fingers loosely around it, not gripping, not letting go. The older man approached again, stopping just beside him this time, close enough that no distance remained between their words. You do not need to ask them, he said. Elias kept his eyes forward, watching as more figures emerged from the edges of the valley, each one stepping into place like they had been called without sound. I was not going to, Elias replied. The man gave a faint nod, almost a smile, though it never reached his mouth. Good, he said, because men who stand for something do not follow a voice. They follow what they recognize. Elias shifted his weight slightly, feeling the ground firm beneath his boots, the kind of firmness that does not come from force, but from time. He had seen men gather before. In towns. In disputes. In moments that demanded noise and presence. But this was different. There was no shouting. No raised hands. No need to prove anything. Each man who stepped forward did so with the same quiet certainty, not looking to Elias for instruction, but acknowledging him with a glance, a nod, a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken. A young rider passed by, no more than 20, his posture straight, his eyes calm, and for a brief second, he met Elias's gaze, then continued on, taking his place among the others. No words, just recognition. The horses began to form a loose line, not rigid, not forced, stretching across the valley like a horizon drawn closer to the ground. 10 riders. Then 20. then more, each one joining without disrupting the stillness that held them together. Elias did not count at first. He did not need to. The number did not matter yet. What mattered was the way they stood, the way they waited, not for him to lead, but for the moment to arrive. The older man stepped forward once more, turning slightly to look across the growing line, his eyes moving from one rider to the next, not checking, not commanding, just witnessing. "They know what was taken," he said quietly. Elias looked at the line now, really looked, seeing not individuals, but something larger, something that did not belong to one man alone. "And they know what it means," the man continued. Elias nodded once, slow, deliberate. "So do I." The wind moved through the valley again, lifting small trails of dust that curled and settled without urgency. The sun climbed higher, light catching on metal, on leather, on eyes that did not waver. Elias reached into his saddlebag and took out the broken cedar once more, holding it up, not above his head, not as a signal, just enough for those nearest to see. The split line down the middle caught the light, the name still clear, still his, even in two pieces. A few riders shifted their gaze toward it, not in curiosity, but in understanding. The older man looked at it, then at Elias. "A name is not made whole by putting it back together," he said. Elias lowered the wood slightly. "No," he replied. "It is made whole by standing where it belongs." The man gave a small nod, stepping back this time, not away, but into the line, becoming part of it rather than apart from it. Elias stood alone for a moment. Though he was not alone anymore, the space around him filled with quiet presence, with men who had chosen to stand without being asked. He turned then, slowly, his movement unhurried, his gaze shifting toward the ridge they had crossed, beyond it, toward the land that had been taken, the porch that no longer held his name, the men who believed the story had already ended. Elias placed the broken cedar back into his saddlebag, securing it with care, then stepped toward his horse. He mounted in one smooth motion, the leather settling beneath him, the familiar weight returning without effort. He did not raise his voice. He did not give a command. He simply turned his horse toward the ridge. And one by one, without signal, without sound, the riders turned with him. They came over the ridge without a sound, not like a storm, not like a threat, but like something that had always been there and had simply chosen to be seen. The line of riders stretching behind Elias Crow in a slow, steady movement that carried no urgency and no doubt. Dust rose beneath their horses, but it did not scatter wildly. It followed them, low and controlled, like the land itself was moving with them instead of against them. From the far side of the valley, the ranch came into view again, the same fences, the same porch, the same stretch of ground that had once answered only to the weight of Elias's hands. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The men who had taken it were there, just as before, though not in the same way. One stood near the fence, another by the trough that had been moved, a third on the porch, his posture less certain than it had been days ago. They saw the riders before they heard them. That was the way of it. Movement before sound. Presence before explanation. One man stepped forward, shading his eyes, trying to understand what he was looking at, and for a moment, he could not. Because there was no banner, no shouted warning, no rush of hooves pounding toward him, just a line of riders approaching at the same pace, measured, even, unbroken. Elias did not ride at the front in the way a leader might. He rode where he had always ridden, slightly ahead, but not above, his posture the same as it had been when he left, steady, quiet, unclaimed by anything except the path beneath him. As they drew closer, the details began to settle. The number of riders, the stillness in their shoulders, the way their eyes did not wander. The man on the porch straightened, his confidence not gone, but no longer certain of itself. "That is him," one of them said, his voice low, carrying just enough to reach the others. The man near the fence shifted his stance, not stepping back, but no longer leaning. "He brought people," another said, though the words sounded uncertain, like they did not fully explain what stood before them. Elias slowed his horse before reaching the fence line, the riders behind him doing the same without being told, the line holding its shape, its quiet weight settling into the ground between them and the men who stood on land they believed was theirs. No one spoke at first. The wind moved lightly across the open space, brushing against coats, stirring small trails of dust, filling the silence without breaking it. Elias looked at the porch, at the spot where his chair had once been, at the door that had stood open in a way that did not belong to him. Then he looked at the men. Not with anger, not with accusation, just with recognition. The man from the porch stepped down slowly, boots meeting the ground with a sound that felt louder than it was. He reached into his coat, not quickly, not in threat, but with the kind of movement a man makes when he believes something written down will protect him. He pulled out folded papers, holding them up slightly, as if they carried weight beyond the ink. "This land is under claim," he said, his voice steadier than his posture. "Signed and witnessed." Elias did not move. He did not reach for anything. He simply listened. The riders behind him remained still, not tightening, not shifting, their presence unchanged, like a line drawn that did not need to be reinforced. Elias reached into his saddlebag slowly, his movement deliberate, giving no reason for tension to rise, and withdrew the broken cedar. He held it in one hand, not lifting it high, not presenting it as proof, just letting it rest there where it could be seen. The split edge caught the light, the name still clear, still his, even divided. The man with the papers glanced at it, then back at Elias, confusion touching his expression for the first time. "That does not prove anything," he said. Elias gave a small nod, once. "No," he replied. His voice was calm, even, carrying across the space without force. "It does not." The words settled, not as agreement, but as something deeper. The man shifted, his grip on the papers tightening slightly. "Then you have nothing to stand on," he said. Elias looked at him for a long moment, then past him, to the land stretching beyond, the fences, the ground that had known his steps long before ink had touched paper. Then he looked back, his expression unchanged. "I am not standing on paper," he said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier now, not empty, but full, filled with something that had not been there before, something the men on the porch could not hold in their hands or fold into their pockets. Behind Elias, the riders remained still, their presence not pressing forward, not retreating, just there, like the land itself had come to stand beside him. And for the first time since they had taken it, the ground beneath their feet no longer felt entirely theirs. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling across the land like something long overdue, and Elias Crow sat steady in his saddle, the broken cedar still in his hand, not raised, not hidden, just present, the way truth often is when it no longer needs to be proven. The man holding the papers looked from Elias to the line of riders behind him, then back again, his certainty thinning in a way he could not quite control. He unfolded the papers as if that would restore something, smoothing them with his hands, glancing down at the ink like it might speak louder the second time. "It is signed," he said, though the words carried less weight now, like they were being said for himself more than anyone else. Elias listened, his expression unchanged, his eyes calm, not fixed on the paper, but on the man who held it. "It is written," Elias replied, his voice low, steady, carrying just far enough. He paused, not for effect, but because the moment required it. But it was not earned. The wind moved again, brushing lightly across the open space, stirring the edges of the paper in the man's hand, as if even it did not hold still under that truth. One of the other men shifted his weight, glancing toward the riders, then back at the ground beneath his feet, like he was beginning to feel something he had not expected. The porch behind them stood quiet, the door still slightly open, the way it had been when Elias first returned, but now it no longer looked like an invitation. It looked like something waiting to be closed. The older man among the riders stepped forward then, not quickly, not to take control, but simply to stand where he could be seen, his presence calm, grounded, undeniable. He did not speak. He did not need to. The space around him carried something that did not come from authority, but from understanding, the kind that cannot be written down or taken away. The man with the papers looked at him, then at the others behind him, the line of riders stretching farther than he had first realized, not crowding, not pressing, just there, like a horizon that had moved closer. "What do you want?" he asked finally, the question coming out slower than before, not sharp, not defiant, just uncertain. Elias lowered his hand slightly, the broken cedar resting against his leg once more. He looked at the man, then at the land, then back again. "Nothing that is not already here," he said. The words settled in a way that did not demand agreement, but left no room for argument. The man swallowed, his eyes drifting down to the paper again, then back up, as if trying to measure something that no longer fit inside what he held. Behind him, one of the others took a step back, small, almost unnoticed, but it was enough. Then another shifted, not leaving, but no longer standing the same way. The ground between them changed, not physically, but in the way it was understood. The man with the papers lowered them slowly, his grip loosening, the edges no longer held as tightly as before. He looked at Elias, really looked this time, not at his horse, not at the riders, but at the man himself, the way. He sat without force, without anger, without the need to take more than what was his. This place, the man said, his voice quieter now, it is yours. Elias did not answer right away. He let the question sit, not because he needed time, but because the answer was not something that needed to be rushed. He looked out over the land, the fences, the porch, the ground that had held his work, his silence, his years. Then he looked back. It belongs to the one who stands for it, he said. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than ownership, something that could not be signed or transferred. The man nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if something inside him had settled into place. He folded the paper, not with care this time, but with acceptance, and slipped it back into his coat without looking at it again. No one spoke. No one moved quickly. One by one, the men who had stood on that porch stepped away, not pushed, not forced, just choosing to no longer stand where they had. The space opened, quiet, unclaimed again in the way that mattered. Elias did not follow them with his eyes. He did not watch them leave. He simply turned his gaze back to the porch, to the door, to the place where his chair had once been. He guided his horse forward, slow, steady, crossing the space that had once been taken from him, not as a man reclaiming, but as a man returning. The riders behind him did not move forward with him. They remained where they were, their presence still, their purpose already fulfilled. Elias reached the porch and stepped down, his boots meeting the wood with the same quiet sound they had made years ago. He stood there for a moment, then reached into his saddlebag and took out the broken cedar. He looked at it, the split lines still clear, then walked to the door and set it gently against the frame, not fixing it, not forcing it whole, just placing it where it belonged. He stepped back, his eyes resting on it for a moment longer, then turned away, the wind moving lightly across the land, carrying no sound, no declaration, just the quiet understanding that some things do not need to be made whole to be right again.